Our learning outcomes for Unit 7, which means our goals for Unit 7 include to describe and analyze colonialism. Colonialism means a European superpower goes into other parts like India, Africa, and Southeast Asia and takes over in one way or another and becomes the superpower in control of the people and the land. The colonial case studies that we will discuss in Unit 7 include British, Belgian, and Dutch superpowers, and the time frame is from about the mid-18th century to the mid-20th century, the mid-1750s through the 1950s. And for this PowerPoint lecture, we will discuss namely the British in India, including as a case study, including an overarching theme that we will see in other parts of the world as well. Our ID words, map IDs, and timeline IDs. And our focus question. So this is something to think about as we lecture. Answer these questions by assessing the textbook readings, the lectures, and the primary source documents. The primary source documents are really interesting. There are 4 primary sources that show or display native Indian perspectives on the British rule in India. So the question is, how and why did Indian views of British colonial rule change over time? In other words, what historical events or personal experiences affected Indian opinions? So when we look at those 4 Indian primary sources and we see the dates, we have to think about what was going on when they wrote their primary source, when they wrote the documents, and what personal experiences did they have? What was going on in their own lives that affected their opinion on the British in particular? When we are discussing European colonialism in India, Africa, and in Southeast Asia, we have to think about European desires, namely, like we see in so many other parts of the world, they want gold and diamonds, which are very valuable for jewelry making and just as money exchange. Ivory, which comes from the tusks of animals like elephants. An extraordinary number of elephants were killed during European colonialism because Europeans really liked the white bone that things were made out of. And so literally hundreds of thousands of elephants were murdered just for their tusks. Their tusks were cut off and they were left to die. Really quite horrifying. Now the ivory trade has become illegal, thank goodness, but it still happens because it is still a lucrative business. Also, Europeans wanted land, namely for things like fields to produce goods like cotton, and timber, namely for rubber trees to make things like tires eventually, and then markets. Markets are places to sell finished products. So European colonial powers take raw materials from colonies in places like India, Africa, and in Southeast Asia, and they produce them into manufactured items in Europe with their machines, namely, and then they send them back to the markets in Africa, Asia, and in Southeast Asia to sell, and they sell these goods, these finished products, for a very high rate. And of course, they also want labor power to work in those fields, in those plantations, and in the mines. There's this idea of new imperialism, which equals economic colonialism, and this is from 1840 till 1914. So after the desire for colonialism to be slightly suppressed, a new imperialism comes into power, and that's an economic colonialism where European superpowers are more influential based only on the economy. Of course, that's not true because they are involved in other things as well, because when you're involved in an economic aspect, you're controlling the people and the land as well. So the idea behind this is called mercantilism. Mercantilism is based on the idea that the world is like a pie and there's a limited amount of the world, and everybody wants a bigger slice. And in order to get a bigger slice, they have to be more powerful. And if you are more powerful, that is correct. That is righteous. That is according to God. And so the idea of might equals right is a big basis to what mercantilism is. And how does it work? Well, first world nations, I put quotations around first world. That is a very contentious term because it kind of implies that people in the first world are first, are awesomest, are the bestest. I'm using improper grammar here to prove a point. First world people are industrialized markets and places, generally speaking urbanized, meaning people who live in cities as opposed to in rural areas or in farms. And industrialized meaning big factories are the rule, not the exception. And first world peoples become colonizers, and they exploit other people. They take goods from their colonies. And so the third world people, again in quotation marks, because again, if someone is called coming from the third world, it kind of sounds like they're third place. They're not first place. They're kind of lower on the rank of social and political and economic power. And that's it also sort of implies that people in the first world are better somehow. But third world nations are not industrialized. They generally have small businesses, smaller farms, more rural. They are not urbanized. They are more farmland type, living in separated places rather than in big cities. And they are the people who are colonized, the areas, the territories who are under the control of the colonizers. And these third world, not industrialized people are the suppliers of raw materials and the markets where the first world people sell their goods. There is also, of course, the degradation of nature, meaning the destruction of nature. Mining, as we discussed in the last unit, just destroys the environment. You cut down trees in order to be able to get to the goods underneath, and taking out trees ends up removing the topsoil. And when you mine, you cut down basically mountains in order to get minerals and metals from inside of the mountain, or diamonds or gold, things like that. And all of the toxic materials that are used and all of the stuff that comes out that is waste goes right into the rivers and into the air. So mining really is hard on nature, and the use of fossil fuels to burn as opposed to renewable energy, that has a really big challenge. And in general, many trees are cut down, a lot, because farms need to be produced to create big plantations for mass products, cash markets basically, things that are sold for cash. How does mercantilism work? Well, European colonizers use what is called tools of empire. So first of all, with the industrialization, with European superpowers industrializing and creating factories to create tools and products, this propels the European world into military superiority. So first they start out by producing things like muskets, which is an early form of gun, and you load the bullets, and then you load the gunpowder, and you pack it all in there, and then you can pull the trigger. And that turns into rifles that are breech loading on the side, and then eventually you can put in a bullet that has the bullet and the gunpowder all in one casing, and that's much faster to load. And then you just load it and fire. And then eventually they create the Maxim gun, which is an early form of a machine gun, and it could shoot 11 rounds a minute. And that's a big deal when you're comparing that to a musket that shoots a bullet every 2 minutes or so. And of course, other machines are created with industrialization, namely tools for all sorts of different products, and steel-hulled ships that are run on steam power, steam ships, steam engines. And that's huge as compared to um, wind power and sails. The people who have ships that are steel-hulled with steam engines, they can go anywhere they want a lot faster than everyone else. So that definitely gives them the upper hand as far as military superiority goes. In addition, European colonizers increase nationalism. Nationalism can be kind of a bad word if it's taken in the wrong direction, but nationalism is basically pride in someone's nation. And in this case, pride in your own European nation would lead to putting down other people, both in other nations in Europe and in other parts of the world, like in Africa and in India and in Southeast Asia, because if you're awesome, everyone else has to be less than you. And that creates a dichotomy, a social split between the superpowers and those who have less power, have less industrialized stuff. And that also leads to increased cultural superiority, of course. That's maybe the definition for that, or the name of that. And that also leads to the idea of social Darwinism. We've already discussed this, but basically Darwin's theory of evolution is that an animal or a plant species will survive if it is fit to survive in different forms of nature, different temperatures, things like that. Social Darwinism takes that idea and turns it into might equals right. If you are more powerful, then you will survive. And if you are more powerful, that definitely is based on the type of military superiority you have, the types of tools you have, the types of bigger guns, etc. So this leads to what is called the Great Game. And this is based again on the idea of might equals right. The Great Game is the game that Europeans, quote unquote, played to take a hold of other parts of the world and control it. So Europeans literally thought, oh, the French are going to go there. I need to go there faster and harder and take over. And that's how so much of the world was split into European superpowers controlling other parts of the world like Africa and in Asia. And here's that image of social Darwinism with the white male at the top in the center and the most powerful, and the list goes down and the faces go down and get darker and more Asian and more Indian and blacker as you go down. And so the top goal of all humans is to become like that white Englishman, Anglo-Saxon. And this, of course, also leads to the ideas that the white people are the super race and everyone else is lesser. So that again instills more racist philosophies and ideas, and it creates this idea that white people deserve to be on top because they were built that way by God. In regard to the new imperialism, there are a lot of political contradictions and hypocrisies. At home in Europe, there are revolutions to create more democracy and a more republican form of ruling, where first land-owning males end up taking power and having the right to vote. And then eventually that right to have a say in government spreads to more men. This does not include women until the early 1900s, the early 20th century. Women don't get the right to vote until then, and neither do slaves or people who are considered to be in very similar slave-like statuses, such as indentured servants. But the right to vote and the right to have a say in government expands dramatically from the late 18th century forward, from the late 1700s forward. And there's a huge push for modernization in Europe as well. There are technologies and buildings and the desire to create and grow and develop, and that's seen as a positive thing in Europe. In the colonies, however, modernizing is seen as um, kind of hypocritical and inauthentic. And so there's a desire to keep modernization and technology out of colonies, and instead they're ruled by dictatorships from European superpowers. And the colonies in places like Africa and India and in Asia, they're kept rural and traditional because that is seen as more authentic, more real. And we want to be nice to those people and keep them the way they are. Of course, that completely suppresses their ability to grow and develop like we see in Europe and in America as well. But we're talking about those types of colonial powers, and so they're kept kind of traditional. There's also something called gendering in the empires, which means that white men are considered or viewed as virile and powerful and strong and sexual and masculine, and men who are not white, men from the colonies in Africa and in India and in Asia, are kind of effeminized. They become weaker or viewed as weaker unless they're part of what is called a martial race, a group of people who are naturally part of a powerful group of people who will make great soldiers underneath these superpowers and can work for the superpower colonies. And women, white women, have to be protected from black men and Indian men and Asian men because all of those men are barbarous and animalistic and aggressive and will rape your white women. So white women are very much protected. And black or colored women are kind of seen as slightly more masculinized and animalistic and sexual, and all of these things are very negative in the European perspective. Just a quick review of British rule or British influence in India. It starts out with a great deal of cooperation. The British come into India and they have to kowtow, they have to bow down. It starts with the English East India Company, the EEIC, around the early 1600s. And the EEIC, again, is a joint stock company. They are a group of people who come together with money to support an independent business, but they have the support of the British military, which is a trip to think about. How do you have a private business being supported by the British military? Similar to maybe, say, McDonald's going into another country and having the American military protect the rights of McDonald's, not the people in McDonald's, but the actual company itself. And they come into the Mughal Empire, which is a Muslim empire, and it is a very strong and powerful empire. The Mughals were foreigners from Mongolia. They came down into India, and the majority of the population in India, as you all know, I'm sure, is Hinduism. So there's 80% Hindu population and a 20% Muslim population, and it's a pretty powerful empire. And when the EEIC comes in, they have to beg to just trade there. Eventually, however, the Mughal Empire splinters in the mid-17th century, in the mid-1600s, and by the 1707, it's greatly weakened. Who comes in and influences in a much stronger way? The EEIC, again, a private company, an independent business. And they set up trading posts originally in places like Calcutta and Madras and Bombay, which used to be called Mumbai, and these end up becoming big cities. The trading posts, again, are originally just military supporting a business. It's not women and children, but eventually these trading posts end up becoming really big cities, being under the control of the EEIC. Here's a map with some of those big important cities in India. They don't have Calcutta, which is down here somewhere. They don't have Calicut, which is down here, but there's Calcutta, there's Mumbai, which was the same as Bombay, and just a few other big names here. This is India. Europe is to the top left, and China is to the right, or eventually to the right. Under British rule in India was there cooperation from the 1700s until 1857? Yes, in a lot of ways, but it was a challenged form of cooperation. The EEIC and the British military had control over local collaborators. There were local leaders who supported the British EEIC, and this includes local sepoys, who are Indian soldiers in the British military, and there were local administrators, Indians in the British administration, as kind of middlemen, representatives, and communicators between the British superpower and the local people. And there were rajas, local rulers, local princes, and a lot of them thought, well, the British are very, very powerful. They have a lot of great industry. If I get in good with them, I will have more power, and eventually India will become more powerful too because we will collaborate and work together. So there was definitely a great deal of cooperation. However, there were some challenges. We'll talk about the challenges in a moment. And this is very similar to what we see in Africa with African chiefs of local territories who would work with other European superpowers to increase their own power and influence and help their own people in what they thought was the best way possible by cooperating with European powers. There was a small number of Western educated elites in both India and in Africa, people who are Indian and African who ended up going to Europe to get educated in the universities in Europe. And this provided these people with a kind of interesting path to slightly more power and more influence. If someone could read and write, if they were literate in the colonizers' language, if they could read and write in English or in French or in the Dutch language or whatever other European language, that gave them a huge upper hand because they could communicate, they could read, and they were seen as very useful. So they made a lot more money and had a lot more power and influence in their own towns, in their own world. There was, however, what is called a glass ceiling, and we see this in regard to women all the time. But here we're talking about people who were colonized in Africa, India, and Asia, Southeast Asia in particular. And even if they had the best education and were smarter and more successful than the British or other superpowers, they were never allowed to have equal positions than them. They were always kept in lower positions because that provides power to those European superpowers. Finally, we come to the challenges of British rule in India. The Indians kind of considered themselves to be equals until the 1930s, but again, they were not given the type of political power or positions or business positions or power as compared to their European counterparts. Even if they had the same type of education, even if they were better at their job than the Europeans were, they were still not really treated as equals. But there was this idea that it was possible to become equal, that if they worked hard enough, they could attain that. It was never the case, but there's this idea that it was possible until around the 1830s, and then things start to sour. And then the idea comes across that the British want to create a quote-unquote Little England, meaning we're going to make India more like England. We're going to get rid of or reduce the native ideas and things, and we're going to replace them with English things, starting with language. So the Sanskrit and other languages that are spoken, and written in India, we're going to replace that with English. And the religion in India, we don't really think Hinduism is that great, and we're going to promote Christianity. And the culture, and then here's an interesting one, plants. People who are British, of British descent, want to eat and drink things that are familiar to them. So they start planting things that are familiar to them, tea in particular, and cotton, and then opium starts to be uh, manufactured in a sense in India, and the English don't smoke opium, but they eventually end up selling opium to China because the Chinese don't really want anything else aside from silver, and the European superpowers run out of silver, so they provide opium, which is illegal, to China, and it's grown in India. And of course, the English industrial machines come in, and the machines end up replacing a lot of the manual laborers, which is a challenge in India for jobs. And the power itself, the English take over slowly in India, and they become more and more powerful. So they are reducing the native influences and replacing them with English ones. A few more of the really big challenges under British colonial rule. There were condescending systems and sciences, and this is not just under British rule, but under other European rule in not just India, but in Africa and in Southeast Asia as well. These condescending systems, for example, with the British in India, they focused on keeping Indians in a traditional type of culture based on Brahmanism, which is a big part of the Hindu culture. Brahmins are religious leaders, and they kind of are the rulers in a lot of ways as far as how the world works. And based on caste system, which we've already talked about this, but again, it's a social, political, and economic split between the people. And there are upper level castes. The Brahmins are the highest of that level. And it goes down to workers and lower castes that are considered less socially acceptable and have very little political power, and usually are very economically challenged, do not have money. And the British like keeping India in this traditional sense and in this traditional system because that is seen as authentic and what is supposed to be in India. And this is very similar or akin to what Europeans do in what they call tribal Africa. And the chiefs are, like the Brahmins in India, kind of kept as powerhouses, but it is not a developed world. It is not an industrialized world. So they are kind of looked down upon. This is an old way of living, an old system, very traditional, and what Europeans would consider backwards. But they want to keep the people in these colonial areas in India and in Africa and in Southeast Asia in the systems that they have been in for hundreds, if not thousands of years, because that keeps the European superpowers in power. And the definitions change from a local definition of what a person is to a colonial definition. So prior to colonialism, in India, people were not considered Hindus. They would consider themselves whatever Hindu sect they were, and the traditions were localized to a particular region or a group or a Raj, a prince or king. In the Islamic worlds, they were, of course, separate. They were a different religion, but now there was a really big split. The British, in particular in India, wanted to define Muslims as a separate, not Hindu population, and this is kind of a means of separating to conquer, divide and conquer. And so the Muslims were defined and kind of were forced to see themselves to unite as Indians as Muslims against the Hindus within India. And they were definitely not part of the Hindu culture in India. Prior to this, of course, there are separations between Hinduism and Islam, but the people would work together and eat together and etc. They lived in the same areas, and they weren't considering themselves so separated. And this can be easily compared to Africa, where people used to consider themselves part of a local village or a kinship group, a family group, or an empire or a language group. And this changed to a definition of race and tribe. And this is a European colonizer definition of tribes. And eventually Africans took this on for themselves to define themselves as belonging to the African tribe. This is an image of what is called a durbar, an imperial durbar, and it's a procession, parade to show the people, to demonstrate the power and the wealth of the British Empire, the rulers at the time, the colonizers. And you see a lot of syncretism here. You see a blending of British and Indian culture. There are elephants that have carriages on them that are very British in style, and you see who's leading this procession. It is a British military commander who's wearing a big white hat in his British military uniform, and some woman, probably his wife, and they are being shaded with an umbrella that is being held by an Indian man. It is likely that this Indian is Sikh, S-I-K-H, and the Sikhs are considered part of the martial race, the military race of men, and a lot of Sikhs ended up being in the British military, as you can see based on the guy's hat up here, the turban that he's wearing here. And then all of the people down here are wearing Indian style outfits, but are definitely reminiscent of British attire, British military wear, especially the colors and the things that they're holding have the British royal crown on top, sitting on top of them. They're also holding guns, muskets, or rifles, which are military created and European created. And even though there is someone up here who is Indian who is sitting on an elephant, he's second in command or way down the line. There are a few elephants back here and they have Indian people in them. And those are likely a local Raj, a local prince or local princes who are higher ranking than the normal people in India, but again, the Europeans are the ones in lead. This image was made in 1903, and so we can definitely see that even though the British are powerful in 1903, their influence is blended with the Indian culture, in India at least, not so much in England. And definitely shows social rank, and there we go. Okay. A few more of the really big challenges that the British had in their rule in India. There were major abuses against Indian workers. And we're not just talking about being humiliated by British leaders. The Indians were actually physically beaten on a regular basis. They had very few rights, and the rights that they had were constantly being challenged. And the abuses against the workers started to take a toll. There was, of course, the idea of social Darwinism that a lot of people really thoroughly believed, or the idea of racism, of a superior race. And the Indians themselves, many did believe that the white people were superior to them, but there's only so much that someone can handle physical and mental abuse before they break and crack, and that's what we see coming. Again, racism, and then there's also that white man's burden, the idea that it is the need of white men to help the other races. The superior white race has to help the other races, and that's white man's burden. And they help them by turning them into slave-like workers and abusing them and beating them up to train them to become better people somehow. That's the logic or illogic behind social Darwinism and the idea of white man's burden and the moral push for colonialism in other parts of the world. And then one of the last big ones, the EEIC, the English East India Company, used sepoys in China. Now, sepoys, again, are Indians who are military men in the British Army. So they're Indians in the British military, and they take them and use them in China as protection when they are selling that opium that is illegal in China. A problem with this is that the majority of the sepoys are Hindu, and they believe that if they die outside of India, their soul will not be reincarnated and they will not go to the next life, which is a really big fear for a lot of Hindus. And then lastly, the Enfield rifle. This changes things because the Enfield rifle is a lot more accurate than the musket. It's much faster to load because the bullets, again, have the bullet and the gunpowder in one casing. So rather than taking 2 minutes to load a gun, it takes a few seconds to load a gun, which is really, really impressive and time consuming, and the shot is not just more accurate, but it can go farther. So the Enfield rifle really changes the game and propels Britain to become even more powerful. A problem with the Enfield rifle and the bullets is that they are encased in something that uses animal fats, including pig or cow fat. Now, for people in India, if they are Muslim, they do not eat pig, and if they are Hindu, they do not eat cow. And the problem with the bullet being encased with cow or pig fat is that in order for it to work, you would have to bite the bullet and bite the casing. So the Hindus and Muslims thought that the British were literally trying to make them break their religion and their religious rules by eating the animals that are sacred to them or considered not halal, not kosher, not edible. You're not supposed to eat pig. And this was just a huge slap in the face and really seen as a push against the local cultures, the Muslim and Hindu cultures within India. So what happens? Rebellion. And rebellion happens in all colonies. But in the British rule, when the British are controlling parts of India, the rebellion happens in a pretty interesting way. Oops. One big example of one of the really big rebellions is the Indian Sepoy Rebellion, and it took place from 1957 through 1958. The British are extremely superior in their military capacity. They even end up creating the Maxim gun, which again is like an almost automated gun that shoots 11 bullets a minute. And racism increases tremendously based on the results of this rebellion. But what ends up happening is the Sepoys, those Indians who are part of the British military, they rebel, they turn against the British military, and they end up massacring many British men, women, and children. There's no regard for who the people are. If the people were British, these Sepoys were out to get them, and they did. The British, with their military superiority, however, returned the favor and absolutely annihilated Indian towns and villages and wiped people out completely. They fought back a lot harder than the Sepoys fought because they had the ability to with a superior military. And this ended the EEIC, the private joint stock company, the English East India Company, was deposed in a sense, and instead the British royalty formally took over, and it became what is known as the era of the British Raj, the British princes, basically, the British rule. And this lasted from 1858, from the end of the Sepoy Rebellion, through 1947, when India formally gained independence after World War II. During this almost 100-year period, India was considered the crown jewel of the English Empire because the English had so much power and control, and so many amazing, magnificent things came from India, like cotton and opium that was again sent to China, and tea. Additionally, the Suez Canal was finally established in 1869, and this allowed for east-west trade to go much faster. Rather than going all the way around Africa, the British could trade through the Mediterranean Sea and through the Red Sea down into India, and it would take, rather than 2 years, it would take 2 weeks. Additionally, opening the Suez Canal under British power allowed the British to tax anyone who wanted to go through there. Let's look at a map. There is the Suez Canal. England is up here. Britain is up here, these little islands. And it used to take 2 years to go all the way around Africa and go into India to trade. And instead, rather than 2 years, the British could then go through the Mediterranean Sea and down in through the Suez Canal, through the Red Sea, and into the Indian Ocean, into India, taking 2 weeks. It took off almost 2 years of travel time, which of course saved a lot of money and provided a lot of income for the British. And here's a close-up look of the Suez Canal right here. This is the Mediterranean Sea, and yeah, made it really easy for the British to come in through the Mediterranean Sea, skip through the Suez Canal, down the Red Sea, and into India over here. And not just the British could trade, but lots of other people. And when you pass through this Suez Canal, which saves 2 years off of your travel time, you end up paying the British a fat fee to go through their canal. So our focus question again, how and why did Indian views of British colonial rule change over time? And in other words, what historical events or personal experiences affected Indian opinions? We're going to look at these primary source documents in class, but just a hint as to what you will see. One is titled Seeking Western Education by Ram Mohan Roy, and his writing was called Letter to Lord Amherst. This is written in 1823, and it shows that the Westerners, the British, are establishing schools in India, and that is greatly appreciated. However, they are Sanskrit schools, keeping Indians in the dark, so to speak, according to Ram Mohan Roy. He thinks that the British should provide Western education with science and math and chemistry and all of those good things, and English, and they don't need Sanskrit and Hindu culture being taught to them in their schools. They've had that for thousands of years. They want to be modernized, and that's in 1823. The next date is 1857, and this is right around the Indian Rebellion. It's written by Prince Firoz Shah. The name Shah shows us that he is a Muslim leader. So this is a Muslim prince who writes the Azamgar Proclamation. And this is basically saying that if someone follows the British and supports the British, especially during this Indian Rebellion, that when the Indians rule and win, that those people will be considered betrayers and will lose everything. Whereas if people support the Indian Rebellion and get rid of the British, then they will return to their power and they will receive the wonderful things that they should receive, like proper education and their land and good jobs and equal pay, etc. So Prince Firoz Shah is very angry at the British. After the EEIC is kicked out and after the Royal British take over formally with the era of the British Raj, and that's 1858. This is written, the next one is written in 1871, and it's titled Credits and Debits of British Rule in India. The guy's name is Nairoji, and he wrote Speech to a London Audience, and he basically breaks down the great things that the British have done, gives them a lot of credits. You've provided us with education, you got rid of sati, which is the practice of a wife burning herself on her husband's funeral pyre if her husband were to die, and a lot of other great things that the British provide for the Indians in India. However, he also lists a great deal of debits of things that the Indians have not received that they have been promised by the British, like equal job opportunities, for example. And so it's kind of an interesting way of attempting to negotiate with the British to help propel the Indians into a more powerful position in their own country under the rule of the British. And then lastly, in 1909, we see a writing of one of my favorite people, Mahatma Gandhi, who's kind of considered the father of India. And he writes about modern globalization, and it's called Indian Home Rule. He wants to get rid of not just the British power, but the British influence. He thinks that their machines need to be removed, and technologies need to be removed, and their culture and their systems need to be removed, and India should go back to the way it was before the British influenced. And he thinks that his elders, his forefathers, were smart, and they actually were. If you look at early world history, the Indians were the most advanced in so many ways, including the most advanced sewer systems and water systems, and just brilliant people. And he thinks that the British have ruined things, and rather than modernizing and becoming more powerful, that they need to go back and become more moral. That's more important to him. So that's what those four, that's a very basic outline of what those four primary source documents talk about. And I think they're really interesting, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion of them in class. In India, there's an attempt to bridge the Hindu-Muslim divide. And it starts out a long time ago, in the 15th century, in the 1400s, and it's called a Bhakti Hindu movement. And there's a disregard for caste and for rituals, for Brahmanism, for example, and instead they focus on union with the divine, a connection just to God. And rather than splitting people into different religious groups and sects, they focus on unity and connecting to God. And then there's another religion that is created, which is kind of interesting. It's Sikhism. This is how it's pronounced, Sikhism. And it's led by a man named Guru Nanak. Guru is a leader, so Nanak was his name. In the mid-15th century is when he was born, and he ruled, or not ruled, but he led through 1539, through the early 16th century. And he focused on rejecting definitions of Hindus and Muslims, or Hinduism and Islam. And instead, he focused on uniting people. And he did this in an interesting way with a communal kitchen. People would come together for their meals. I visited a Sikh temple when I was in college, based on the advice of my professor who was Sikh, S-I-K-H, not unhealthy, Sikh as in the religion. And it was one of the most amazing experiences. They welcome people with open arms. You don't have to pay for anything. It's all vegetarian food. It's beautiful. Everyone sits on the floor as equals, and it's a community there. They also wear a distinct dress, in particular their turbans, and they have a few other rules, like the men are not allowed to cut their hair. They have to be always clean, so daily showers and washing their hands all the time. And they have to carry a short sword, which is more symbolic today in a lot of parts of the world, except for maybe in the Punjab, which is in the northern region of India. But they became very militaristic, which is why they have to carry the short sword to defend themselves against, which was started as Hindus and Muslims who hated them for kind of creating a different philosophy. It's threatening to the people. Here are a couple images. So the first one is the map, and this red territory is the Punjab, which is where the Sikh culture today centers. And this is the biggest Sikh temple in India. And this man, you can see he has a turban, the long beard, because you're not allowed to cut your hair, and the sword. My professor did not carry a little sword around. It was more of a symbol for him. Again, this is the Indian Empire as controlled by the British, and this includes modern day Pakistan here on the west side, and on the other side there are several other nations today, including Thailand. Okay, so in Africa, we will continue this in class, and I hope you enjoyed learning about the British in India.